We started this conversation with a really audacious claim that the local church, as God designed it, is the hope of the world. And that's a huge statement. But we recognize not everybody believes that. And in fact, some would even go so far to say that the church is the enemy. The church is doing harmful things. Tim, why is that?
As I've thought about that, Ephesians 6 has been really helpful to me. That one thing Paul says in Ephesians 6 is that the way we look at the world matters. So for 5 chapters, we've looked at them. He's laid out this very high theology of what the church is. But now in Ephesians 6, as he ends his letter, he starts to call the Christians to look out into the world and think about the world in which they're going out into mission on. And he says a couple of things I think are worth reading. He tells the church, put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, authorities, cosmic powers over this present darkness, spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. And we hear that like in our day, we get weirded out because we're scientific. Everything we see in front of us is what we use to explain things. But Paul thinks there's really something important that you have to see in the world if you're going to operate in the world faithfully on Christian mission. And the way I think about it is my wife is a really good singer, a really good harmonizing singer. So she can hear a song and hear all the different notes you could sing to go along with the melody, whereas I can only hear the melody. And I can carry a tune okay, but I can't harmonize at all. I can't hear those notes. And so generally when we're in the car together and I try to start singing harmony, I just get dirty looks from her, just stop, you're terrible. Because I can't hear that. And I think what Paul is saying is the world in which you live is a deeply complex world, and the evil that you're the hope against it has supernatural roots. It has demonic roots to some extent. And so the people around you that you want the gospel to get to, the cities you want the gospel to get into, the roots of the evil there are deeply supernatural and have a source that is satanic.
One of the things that is beautiful about Paul's writing in Ephesians is we have 5 chapters devoted to the supernatural resources the church is given for its very earthly mission in the world, right? And then we get to chapter 6, and it's not like there's a devil under every rock, but Paul reminds us that this supernatural resources for a very earthly mission has supernatural opposition. And it makes sense to us, and somehow we almost want to wince when we understand that what Jesus loves most, the local church's bride, is what Satan hates most. So it's not a surprise, even though it's not welcome, that the local church is the object of hell's greatest fury.
Wow. Well, that got heavy fast. But this is a really important point, right? As we think about the conflicts around us, the difficulties in our world, this makes a big difference understanding where those problems are ultimately coming from. Tim, how do you see this difference working out?
Well, I think we cannot forget Paul saying our wrestling is not against flesh and blood. It's not against other human beings. And as we think about living within this culture and people who may appear to us to be cultural enemies or political enemies or oppose the gospel or oppose the church in some ways, we can't forget that our wrestling ultimately is not against them. It's not against other human beings. And if we believe that frees us up to love every human being, to embrace every human being, to not see them as our enemy, but them as someone whom God loved and sent his son to die for. It just changes the way we see our world. And I think in particular what that means for us is we should have 2 attributes as Christians. We should be incredibly hopeful people, because when Paul goes into all of this armor language, which is kind of maybe a little strange to us, what he's doing is he's referencing Isaiah 59 when God took up armor to fight for his people. And Paul's saying now we get the armor that God fought for and won for us in. And so when we remember the gospel story, we remember the evil around us, it's being triumphed, but it was triumphed through a cross, through suffering. And so even when we are opposed or even when we have opposition, those are not our enemies ultimately. And ultimately there's victory often through suffering. So one, we can be very hopeful. People are also realistic. I think sometimes when we think about demons or devils, we think, oh, that's a naive view of evil. And actually, I think the opposite. I think that's actually a deeply complex view of evil, that when we walk out of our services on Sunday morning and step into the city, we're not just trying to change a few laws. We're not just trying to convince a few people to become Christians. There are deeply systematic evil things that are going on. And it's not just that one sinner plus one sinner equals 2 sinners. It's they compound and they expand. And the reality of that evil is so deep that we I think as Christians have a very realistic view of the world in which we live.
Yeah, well, and that frees us then to live out our faith with a faithful presence, right? I mean, that's a big deal.
One of the things I love about the conversation is that as we've articulated, and you've articulated really well, that our enemy is not another human being, that we're all image bearers, then it changes our posture of love toward them. Not in a naive way that the evil one is not at work, but it changes our posture. And Christians throughout the century have wrestled with what does it mean to be a sense of a pure Christian in proximity with the world, right? This purity, proximity tension has been a part of all of our struggles. Some Christians are more focused on purity, so they're more separate from the world or the culture. Others are more cozy and accommodating in proximity. But faithful presence within a culture, I think, best articulates the biblical picture of incarnation, that we are salt and light, that we are to live this out in the world in love. And a faithful presence does not go to separation or accommodation, it goes to full incarnation. And the idea, again, is everything we are, everything we do is a part of that witness to a culture of love.
Tim, what does that look like to be this faithful presence as a church?
Well, I mean, a couple thoughts. One is, it's first, and we've talked about this before in a previous session, but it means we proclaim this gospel to our city. It's a news we have to share about evil being overcome, and everything that we see breaking down in this world, Jesus is eventually going to make new in the new heavens, new earth. But it's not just that. I think also there's a corporate nature to Ephesians 6, that it's not just individual Christians who put on the armor and then we go off on our own way. And it's why, I think it's part of why we're multi-site. It's a part of why, even as we do our work in the city, we tend to do it with partners whom we see doing good work, and we want to join together in create an institutional strength in our engagement in the city. And so faithful presence is incarnation through our workplaces and our daily life, but it's also the corporate nature of the church, working with other organizations in the city to combat this deeply complex evil that we want to see eradicated in our city.
Yeah, and this works itself out in the workplace as well, right?
It really does. And when we think about the Great Commandment, let's just think of the Great Commandment. That's pretty important, don't you think? Jesus said that summarized the whole Testament. We're to love God and our neighbors ourselves. And when we begin to understand loving our neighbor involves the primary place what we spend every day. And one of the things amazing to me is that in our modern economy, like no other Christians in the history of the church, we have an opportunity to love not only our neighbor locally, but globally, that God cares about, because the world is his parish. So we can, through our work and the economy and the value add, truly love our neighbor and bring goodness to our world. And of course, gospel proclamation is at the heart of it, but also gospel presence as we live this out every day. And each one of us, God has placed in a particular, specific place to love our neighbor and to be God's salt and light in the world and be a faithful presence for the gospel there.
Yeah, well, Tim, how do we get started? What's the next step? And really not just the next step from this session here, but as you think about this series coming to a close, what's the next thing for us?
Well, we've said it a few times, so people may laugh that we ran out of ideas, and we do run out of ideas, but it's pray. I mean, that's where Paul ends Ephesians. He says, he calls them to pray, and that's really what this language of armor is about, is to pray at all times in the Spirit with all prayer and supplication. And to pray, we talked about praying for Christ's community, praying for people who don't know the gospel, and I would say we need to pray for our city, pray for our neighborhoods, our communities, because I think one thing prayer does is it gives us a hopeful posture. That I remember early, some of my first few weeks at Christ Community, being with Nathan, praying for the church, and I remember just leaving those times just really depressed because people had cancer. No, people had cancer. The culture was moving directions that was just depressing, and I was just overwhelmed. And one thing changed everything for me, and that's Psalm 2. It's sort of an entryway into prayer, the Psalms. And Psalm 2 starts with the psalmist reflecting on the evil of this world. Why do the people rage? The nations plot in vain. The kings either set themselves against the rulers of the world. And what happens then through the rest of the psalm is God answers these powers, these authorities, these evil people who are posturing against him. And God's answer is a Messiah, is Jesus. And Jesus was almost a forgotten person who was put to death by the power structure of his day, the Romans. And yet this Messiah and the church he started, and the church he founded and said the gates of hell will not prevail against, that's God's answer to the evil, supernatural evil, the complex evil we face in the world. And to us, at times, that may feel very underwhelming. And so what prayer does is it reminds you this is the way the world really is. And as I think about, wanting to someday be able to harmonize like my wife, that will be possible. But But I need to practice. Like I need to be able to hear the songs and hear the different notes. And prayer is the practice of getting into the world of God, where he defeats evil through suffering, where he chooses messiahs and not powerful kings, where he plants churches, doesn't take control of governments. And when you begin to see that, and you begin to see God at work in the world and what he's doing, then the saying the local church is God designed is the hope of the world, it's not a far-fetched reality. It's happening all around us.